This is a video about the YouTuber JJ Mccullough and the strange way he pronounces the word about.
And on this channel, we love to talk about culture and symbols. We are going to talk about something that I have always wondered about. Everyone's favorite Canadian YouTuber who doesn't talk about Minecraft or tech unboxing.
I want to preface this video by saying that I don't believe that JJ is faking his accent. But I do think there are some very strange things going on and some inconsistencies, and I think it's going to be interesting to explore that. To begin with, let's talk about what Canadian raising is. JJ gives an explanation in his video on the topic.
Canadian raising phenomenon. This refers to the weird way many Canadians pronounce the ow sound in words like house and down and ruined and south.
But it's kind of hand-wavy, and I think we're going to need to get into a little bit more detail. So let's do a bit of a linguistics info dump. In English, we have many vowel sounds, and we also have these things called diphthongs. A diphthong is a vowel which shifts over the course of the vowel sound from one vowel sound to another. The two diphthongs which are related to Canadian raising are the ow diphthong, which you might say if someone punched you in the chest, and the I diphthong, which would be the personal pronoun or your eyeball. I think these two words, ow and I, are good examples of these diphthongs because they are the diphthong in isolation. They don't have consonants before or after it, and so you can really hear it in your mouth, the change in the sound. Whereas the diphthongs change over time, the regular vowels stay constant, like E, oo, ah. Now in Canadian English, we have two versions of each of these diphthongs. You can see in this chart the long versions are the regular versions of the diphthongs, and the shorter ones, starting higher up, are the Canadian raised versions. An example of this difference is the word house and the verb to house. In Canadian English, the word house is raised, and what that means is that the diphthong makes less of a journey. It begins higher, so it has less of distance to move. House. And in the word house, you get the full diphthong that you hear in an American accent. Whereas an American might have the same diphthong for both words. They would say house and house, and a Canadian would say house. Note that the pronunciation is not hoose, and I believe that JJ would not pronounce the word as hoose either. But we'll come back to his pronunciations. So you might ask, what is the reason that house is raised in Canadian English, but to house is not? To put it simply, these two diphthongs are raised in Canadian English when they are followed by a voiceless consonant. A voiceless consonant is a consonant which does not vibrate your vocal cords. JJ is mostly focused on the ow diphthong. He doesn't really deal with the I diphthong, so we're going to be focusing on the ow diphthong for the remainder of this. I want to begin by showing JJ saying the word about, demonstrating it himself, and it's kind of a strange start to his video because to my ear, the first time he says it with regular Canadian raising, whereas the second two times he says it in his own kind of unique way.
Something about my hair, something about my mustache, or something about the way I say this word.
Now, I'm going to play the American, the Eastern Canadian, and the Western Canadian pronunciation of this word, and why don't you listen and see if any of them sound like what JJ is saying.
About.
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 Let's listen to JJ one more time.
Something about my mustache, or something about the way I say this word.
To my ear, he's replacing the diphthong ow with oo, which is just a basic vowel, and would therefore not be an example of Canadian raising. But JJ will give us a couple other examples here.
The way I talk is a particularly strong example of what people who study this sort of thing call the Canadian raising phenomenon. This refers to the weird way many Canadians pronounce the ow sound in words like house and down and ruined and south. It even sounds annoying to me.
So JJ lists 4 words: house, down, around, and south. There's some interesting things going on here. House is a word that is raised by Canadians. JJ raises it as well, but he raises it normally. He doesn't raise it to the degree that he does in the word around. Down That is a word that is not raised by Canadians, and JJ doesn't raise it either. But the fact that he lists it here kind of shows he doesn't understand the criteria that makes a word viable for Canadian raising. Similarly, the word around is not raised by Canadians, but JJ actually does raise it, or at least he replaces the diphthong with oo again, much like he did in about. Next, he lists the word south. This is a word that Canadians raise and JJ raises normally. The different way that JJ is pronouncing the word around is not an example of Canadian raising because it doesn't follow the pattern of Canadian raising. Canadian raising does not occur before the N sound. And so it is just a different pronunciation that JJ is using. JJ does have some understanding of the phenomena though, clearly, because he makes an accurate distinction between two ways to pronounce the word mouth.
When I said mouth instead of mouth.
So this is true. This is the right distinction between mouth and mouth.
But what's weird is that I feel a lot of Canadians are very inconsistent about this. I get a lot of teasing from my fellow Canadians because I say about instead of about.
So people notice he says about differently and not in a Canadian way, in a different way.
But I notice a lot of people say route instead of route and no one seems to care.
This is kind of a confusing example to pick apart. The thing is that route and route are both accepted ways to pronounce this word in American English. It doesn't actually have anything to do with Canadian raising. There's just two acceptable ways to pronounce the word.
Route, route.
I want to stress that these are both American recordings of American pronunciations of this word. Ironically enough, in this case, Wiktionary actually lists route as the Canadian pronunciation, and so JJ saying people are kind of being inconsistent on this is just kind of strange because this is just the apparently Canadian way to pronounce it. It might be just taking in a lot of American media, but I've heard route and route. I don't really consider either to be an incorrect way to say the word. I do think it's likely that this simplification that Wiktionary has here, that Canadians pronounce it route, is probably an oversimplification, but you will notice that on the Wiktionary version for the page about, there is no form about anywhere. Okay, so you might be thinking, JJ pronounces about a little bit strangely. What's the big deal? Just how he acquired it somehow, right? Well, I want to be careful with how I say this, but I think it's very unlikely that JJ acquired this pronunciation from any person in real life. And here is where we're gonna hit peak irony.
I blame South Park, which made the whole about thing this big funny joke.
The fuss is about taking our citizens. It's about not censoring our art. It's about...
So he plays this clip of South Park, and the funny thing is, this is the only place I've ever seen anyone pronounce this word this way. I don't think it's possible to make the claim that JJ saw these kind of representations of Canadian pronunciation and then replicated that in his own accent. But I think it's interesting to point out that there's no evidence of any area of Canada where people actually pronounce about the way he does, and he even claims to be made fun of where he lives for his own pronunciation. So what I would like to say to close is just that this pronunciation of about is not an example of Canadian raising. It is an example of a completely new pronunciation of the word. I'm not going to play all the clips of other Canadians speaking that JJ plays in his video. You can go watch it there. But none of those clips show someone speaking in the way that he does when pronouncing words like about or around. Now, there's nothing wrong with pronouncing any word a different way. Some people say tomato, some say tomato, some people say bagel, some say bagel. But the reality is that the way that JJ is pronouncing this word doesn't fit into the constraints of the Canadian raising phenomena, because if it did, he would be raising words like house to hoose, and he would not be raising words like around at all. And listen, my dad calls vegans vegans. Who knows why?